Hello, and thank you for choosing this full-length, clean, historical Western romance by Kat Lynn. We are so happy to have you with us today. Before we begin, don't forget to tap the subscribe button and like and share with your friends. Your support allows us to continue sharing these sweet, heartwarming stories for free. Now, relax and get ready to travel back in time to the American frontier, where we join an adventure to find love and happily ever after. Enjoy. Copyright of Kat Lynn.
The MacPherson Sisters, Book 6, The Horseman's Perfect Sister, by Kat Lynn, Prologue. Polly jerked awake. Disoriented, she glanced around her. Her gaze shifted from the old lady beside her to the child giggling on her mother's lap a seat ahead. Straightening, she stifled a yawn. Her back hurt, her temples were throbbing, and her stomach clenched painfully. She'd felt a lot worse when she'd traveled to Deadwood from New Hampshire a few months before. The journey had taken far too long for her comfort. Polly shifted on her seat and sucked in a long breath. It'd soon be over. Soon she'd get off the train and forget about the discomfort of the journey. Polly strained her neck to look out the window. Seeing nothing but trees and grassland, she sank into her seat and tuned out the old lady's snores. She folded her hands neatly on her lap. All traces of sleep had left her, and her mind drifted to the sisters she'd left behind. She'd miss Rose greatly. Florence, too. She'd left 2 sisters to reunite with 2 others that she hadn't seen in a year. Her excitement was tainted with a hint of longing. A lot had happened in months. She'd left the city she'd grown up in, moved to South Dakota with her eldest sister and younger sister, and left again immediately after Florence's wedding. A smile curved her lip as she reflected on how quickly her sister had changed her mind. Florence had been set on not getting married, then she'd met a wonderful man, and all had changed. Love, Polly mused. Love truly does change people. Her smile faltered. Leaving Florence and Rose while she accepted Winnie's invitation hadn't been too easy. Although she'd missed her sisters, the thought of not seeing Rose and Florence again for a long time was painful. Polly shut her eyes as events of the past 2 years flashed in her mind's eye. The shrill cry of a baby's piercing scream disturbed her thoughts. Her eyes flew open. She glanced out the window, heart fluttering in excitement. "Next stop, Crescent City," the conductor called from several feet away. Polly's heart did a little dance. She was finally in Crescent City. She started tapping her fingers on her lap. She held her breath, craning her neck and wishing, for the 100th time, that she'd gotten the seat next to the window. As the train's steam whistle announced its arrival, a lightness spread in Polly's chest. She drummed her feet against the floor of the train. Shutting her eyes, she sucked in a breath. The train pulled to a stop at the station. A crowd was gathered at the platform. The old lady muttered something underneath her breath, but she didn't wake up. Polly's eyes widened as she took in the scenery. Horses. So many horses. A cluster of men stood on one side of the platform, smoking and laughing loudly. Their hats were drawn low over their heads, and they wore similar clothes, plaid shirts, old jeans, and worn brown boots. A man standing apart from the cowboys caught her eye. He was different. His clothes appeared to have been picked out for a special occasion. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, smoothing his suit and adjusting his hat repeatedly. He was waiting for his bride. Polly's heart fluttered in anticipation, and, for a moment, she imagined she was the bride. She'd step out of the train and be enveloped in his arms. His eyes would light up, and he'd gaze upon her as if she was the most beautiful woman in the world. Oh, golly, was this how her sisters had felt when they were just a few minutes away from meeting their grooms? Huh? The old lady beside her jerked awake. "Are we in Santa Monica?" she asked Polly. "No," Polly said with a gentle smile. The poor old lady had been asleep for many hours. "We're in Crescent City." With a relieved sigh, she leaned back. "I can't wait to see my grandson. Can't wait." Polly grinned. She understood the old lady's anticipation. One of the reasons she'd jumped at the chance to go to Crescent City was so she could arrive before Helen had her baby. Clutching her trunk, she stood and left her seat to join the line of passengers leaving the train. Her pulse thrummed with excitement. So many good things ahead of her. After so many months, she'd finally see Helen and Winnie again. The city was painted with the soft gray strokes of dusk. The streets were imprinted with wagon tracks, cluttered with several horses going to and from the station. Polly scanned the platform. Her gaze fell on the man from earlier. He was speaking to a rosy-cheeked young woman while lugging her trunk to a fancy carriage. Polly smiled. They'd gotten there happily ever after. Hers would come later. For now, she'd enjoy reuniting with her sisters. Polly! Polly spotted Winnie immediately. Winnie dashed forward, waving her hand in the air. Tears clouded Polly's vision. "Win," she muttered as she approached her sister. Winnie had changed significantly. Her skin was darker, and she had a healthy glow. She'd gained a bit of weight, too. She enveloped Polly in a warm hug. Tears sprang to Polly's eyes. She sniffled, smiling through her tears at the gentleman that stood behind Winnie. Her vision was too blurry to make out his features. After a while, Winnie finally released her. "You're all grown up." She spoke as if Polly had been a baby the last time they'd seen each other. "You should see Rose," Polly said with a chuckle. "You wouldn't believe your eyes. Has she grown taller? There's so much you have to tell me." Winnie's grin was wide. "Oh, I can't wait." She beckoned to the tall man behind her. "Meet my husband, Danny." Polly had been too overwhelmed with excitement to notice her sister's husband. He flashed her a welcoming smile. She liked him immediately. "Welcome to Crescent City, Polly. I'm certain you'll like it here." Polly couldn't stop grinning. Danny grabbed her trunk and led them to the waiting carriage. Arm in arm with her sister, she trudged through the gathered crowd to the carriage. Helen wished she could come, but she's far too heavy. How her husband has ordered her never to leave her bed. Winnie giggled. "Poor Helen has had to forfeit horse riding for so long that she's become cranky. She'll be so excited to see you. Now, tell me all about Florence's new husband." Polly laughed. The carriage started to move. She filled her sister in about the events that occurred in South Dakota, detailing how her sister had fallen in love with the head teacher. And she used to be indifferent to the subject of marriage. Winnie said, "I was so shocked when I got your letter that it dropped from my hand. I didn't expect Florence to change her mind at all." Love changes people. It had definitely changed Winnie. "When we get home, you'll rest for a few days. Then I'll take you on a tour around town." Winnie clapped her hands. "I can't wait for you to see Seth's hotel. It's spectacular. That's where I met my husband." She giggled. "Oh, it was so embarrassing." Polly perked up. "I can't wait to hear all about it." There was so much she wanted to find out. How thrilling. The scent of hay and manure hung in the air. Polly grimaced, peering out of the window to the stable on the outskirts of the town. Some men were leading horses away from the surrounding fields. A dark horse caught her eye. A man sat atop it, striding at an even pace into the stable. He sat straight-backed, his hand firm on the reins. Dressed completely in black, he was formidable on his equally dark horse. Polly's breath caught. Her gaze trailed up to his face. She couldn't see it. He was turned away from her, a hat hanging low over his face. He jumped off the horse. Polly strained her neck, hoping to catch a glimpse of his face. The carriage turned a corner. She sat back with a disappointed sigh. The carriage moved to the grassland, leaving the busyness of the town behind. Polly released a long breath. "You must be starving," Winnie said quietly. Her previous excitement had lessened. Her tone was a bit more subdued, calmer. "We're having a special meal for dinner. You might not have heard of it before." At Polly's raised brow, she laughed at herself. "I forgot you've been on the frontier for months. Florence would have whipped up so many delicacies for you." "I've whipped up some myself," Polly said smugly. She'd spent a lot of her time at Deadwood learning how to cook. She'd made a friend that had eagerly shared her recipes and taught her some things. She was far from a talented cook, but she was trying. Well, she didn't have to rush. There was a lot of time for her to perfect her skills before getting married. With a soft sigh, Polly shut her eyes. She was exhausted. A long warm bath, a hearty meal, and half a day's sleep would restore her. A smile curved her lips as she thought of the coming days. She'd explore the town, make new friends, and hopefully get invited to some parties. When Helen gave birth, she'd spend her days catering to her niece. Polly was so lost in her daydream that she didn't know when she drifted off to sleep. A gentle nudge woke her. "Polly, we're home." Polly opened her eyes. She yawned. Darkness had descended. She stepped out of the carriage. A cool breeze caressed her face, rustling the loose ends of her hair. She blinked. Lights flickered from within a house close by. She rubbed at her eyes. "We're home?" "Not quite. We're at Helen's. We would have gone home straight, but Helen insisted she must see you today," Winnie explained. "Our farm isn't far from here." They walked up to the porch. Danny stepped forward to knock. The door opened immediately. A woman stepped out holding a lamp. "Helen's in labor." Chapter 1. Phil Kenton jumped down from the horse, turned his head this way and that, and released a long sigh. He'd narrowly escaped being drafted into the sheriff's posse and embarking on a hunt for an outlaw. He grimaced. Ridiculous. How could he leave his responsibilities to go on a chase that might yield nothing? Not all criminals could be caught. Some walked around free after committing a gruesome crime. No one batted an eyelid because no one knew the crime they'd committed. The direction of his thoughts soured his mood. Dragging his attention to the present, he focused on his surroundings. The livery stable was a large wooden building with the words, "Crescent Livery Stable Board and Hire," painted in red at the top. Several wagons were arranged in neat rows outside the stalls. In a far corner, one of the workers was cleaning a buggy, while another dragged bays of hay into the stalls. Wheels of old wagons cluttered one end of a fenced area in front of the stalls. He inhaled the familiar scent of hay and horsehide, stroking his mare's mane. Did the sheriff expect him to take his horse across many miles in an endless pursuit of a criminal? He'd run from one. He had no intention of facing another. One of his workers dropped a pail and dashed toward him. "I've been looking for you. It's been over 2 weeks since Mr. Richardson hired a horse, and he still hasn't returned it. I just spoke to the sheriff. A warrant will be sent out for his arrest." One of the hazards of the trade. He always took extra care when lending out his horses to new customers, but it was a risk he had to take if he wanted to grow his business. So far, the risks had paid well. Until now. The sheriff had assured him the runaway Richardson would be found and held accountable for his actions. Phil couldn't lose a good horse because a man proved himself dishonorable. "We need extra stalls. I had to turn down 2 people today because the stalls are filled." Phil grinned. "That's wonderful news. People want what they can't have." Simon stared at him blankly. "Are we building new stalls?" "All in due time, Simon. Feed her," he said, handing the reins to him. This was the 3rd time his workers had stated the need for expansion. Times like these, he was always glad the livery was close to the outskirts. Being far from the center of town meant a lot of lands to exercise the horses and expand into when needed. "Where's Hugh?" Phil asked no one in particular. All eyes turned to him. "He left early to pick his bride up at the station." "They'll be married already," another worker, Luke, said, spilling grain into a trough. "He planned to take her straight to the preacher's." "No time for the poor woman to rethink her choice," Simon said. The men laughed. Phil chuckled, amused by their jest. Hugh had mentioned he was expecting his mail-order bride. The young man had been in a peppy mood in the last few days. He'd worked extra hard, humming a happy tune and getting lost in daydreams. The promise of matrimony had put him in a better mood than before. It was a stark contrast to how Phil had felt when he'd been close to getting married. The livery was closing up for the day. The gate squeaked, and horses' hooves thumped across the floor. The horses were led in from the fields and locked in their stalls for the night. Phil stepped away from the entrance as one of his workers, a young teenage boy, led a horse into the stable. "How's the hoof?" Phil asked. The owner had paid a huge sum for them to cater to the horse after it sustained an injury a few weeks before. The boy took the horse out into the fields to exercise every day. "Better," the boy said with a grin. He stroked the horse. "Could hardly suspect he's wounded." Phil grinned. Nothing pleased him more than having horses leave better than they arrived. "Good. Increase his ration and take him out for long walks in the evenings. The owner needs his horse back to full strength in a week." The boy nodded and led the horse away. Luke waved him over. "I've mucked out these stalls, put in some clean straw, and we're set for the night." Picking up a bale of straw, Phil dropped it on the floor of the stall. The smell of urine was faint, replaced by the nose-tickling scent of wheat straw. "Simon's looking after the horses tonight." A week ago, news of rustlers attacking ranches had spread. Although Phil had overheard the conversation between the storekeeper and some of the townsfolk, he hadn't dismissed it as meaningless gossip. Since then, he always took extra care to ensure the animals were safe. If anything happened to the horses, the owners would blame him. He couldn't take that chance. "I'm off," Luke said, dusting his hands. "My wife's making a special meal tonight. I won't dare go home late and risk getting her upset." "Your house is just a stone's throw away," Phil chuckled. Luke didn't leave immediately. "Why don't you join us? My wife makes a mean buffalo stew. Plus, my sister-in-law is visiting. She's a very wonderful lass." Phil heard the meaning behind his words, but chose to ignore it. Of all his workers, Luke was the most chatty. The others kept their dealings with him formal and straight to the point. Not Luke. He treated him less like a boss and more like a friendly neighbor. At first, Phil hadn't cared much for it. Now, he didn't mind. But then, he had to discourage the older man from any attempts at matchmaking. He had a feeling Luke's invitation wasn't about dinner as much as it was about the company. "I appreciate the offer, Luke, but I'm afraid I'll have to decline." The last time someone's sister had visited Crescent City, he'd been a hair's breadth away from being a groom. He hadn't been forced. After his livery had become stable, the next thing he wanted was a wife. He longed for normalcy, anything that would make him look forward to the future with hope. When Helen told him about her sister, it felt just right. No, it seemed right. If all fell into place, he'd have the life he wanted. A flourishing business, a wife, a future, an escape from the past. Taking Helen's offer meant he was spared the drudgery of finding the perfect wife. Then he met Winnie. Winnie had the qualities he wanted: responsible, kind, beautiful. One thing was lacking: attraction. Weeks passed, yet he felt nothing for her. He tried convincing himself feelings didn't matter as long as they were both cordial. How could he end the betrothal after he'd made a promise to her sister? He didn't wish to leave her heartbroken, so he stood by his word to marry her. A gentleman always kept his promise. He was so determined to keep his word to Helen that he told himself love would come later. Then Winnie broke off the courtship, and he was relieved. She deserved a man that loved her, not a man that was hoping to someday love her. Since then, he hadn't resumed his search for a bride. There was always something else to focus on. All right, Luke didn't hide his disappointment. Maybe next time, then. Have a good night, Phil. Phil exhaled in relief. He'd turned down so many invitations to dinner and other social events that he was certain half the town didn't think too highly of him. When he'd set out to Crescent City, he'd had no intentions to make a host of friends and have a thriving social life. He'd had enough of that to last a lifetime. He'd spent many years attending social functions and speaking with distinguished men over glasses of wine. He'd made connections and friends and dined with the elite. He scoffed. Where had that gotten him? None of it mattered in the long run. Not a single thing. All he wanted was peace and quiet, nothing else. "I've seen Luke's sister-in-law," Simon piped up from outside. "She's even prettier than Luke's wife," someone whistled. "A fine lass, that one." "Why don't you ask to court her?" "I ain't ready to give up nights at the saloon." Laughter rippled through the stable. One of them darted a glance at Phil. They fell silent. Phil shot them a dismissive look. "It's getting late." Straightening, the men finished up their tasks, retrieved their hats, and headed out of the livery. Only Simon stayed behind. Phil was about to leave when Luke rushed back. "I forgot my hat. Now I'll be late for sure." Chuckling under his breath, Phil shook his head. Luke always forgot something. He could forget the clothes on his back if possible. Phil started the short walk to his house. He'd built it months after his arrival in Crescent City. He spent his first month in the hotel where he met and befriended Helen. They bonded over their love for horses. His lips curved at the thought of her. Had she given birth? He hadn't received news of her new baby. The last time he'd seen her, she was waddling into the store while her husband scurried after her. His thoughts returned to Hugh. Wouldn't it be thrilling to have something to look forward to? Having a bride, for instance. Perhaps it was time for him to embark on his search for a wife. Soon, he'd be the one rushing to get home in time for dinner and checking to see if he hadn't forgotten his hat. He laughed softly. Ah, if only life were that simple. He could place a nice advert in the paper. Livery owner, 28, desires a wife between the ages of 18 and 25. Required skills, cooking, homemaking. Purpose, matrimony. Yes, maybe he'd do just that. He couldn't keep waiting around without making any efforts to get a wife. This time, he could get lucky and find a woman he was affectionate toward. It would be a lot easier to get married out of no sense of obligation, but of willingness. He'd do things differently. He'd lodge her at the hotel and court her for weeks or months before deciding whether or not to get married. He'd jumped at Helen's offer because it had saved him from the rigor of having to write a mail-order advert. Phil stopped in front of his house. It was a fine structure. Even in the dark, it stood out from the rest of the houses. He'd insisted on a unique design that reminded him of his former home, although on a smaller scale. The white paint glimmered under the moonlight. No light shone through the windows. Phil walked up to the porch, bracing himself for a night of silence. Unlike Luke, he didn't have a wife whipping up a delicious meal. Sometimes he ate at the inn. Other times he cooked something simple and dined alone. He stood in front of the door for several moments. Somehow, the thought of dining alone didn't thrill him. On a whim, he turned and headed toward Luke's house. It was a stark contrast from his. Soft laughter emanated from the home. The gentle murmur of conversation beckoned to him, reminding him of the times he'd spent at dinner parties and balls. The simplicity of the Western home could never compare to the glamorous houses that had hosted the parties back in New York. But somehow, Luke's home reminded him of the good times. He exhaled, raised a fist, and knocked on the door. Warmth enveloped him as the door opened to reveal Luke's wife. A delicious aroma welcomed him, and his mouth began to water. Phil flashed his most charming smile. "Luke invited me to dinner. Is the invitation still on the table?" Her lips spread into a grin. "Of course, please come in." As Phil stepped into the house, a sense of longing threatened to overpower him. No matter how much he tried to run from his past, he could never escape his yearning for the comfort of the home he'd once had. Chapter 2. A week after Polly's arrival in town, Winnie kept her promise to take her on a tour around town. In the past week, Polly moved from Winnie's house to Helen's every day to visit her and the baby. Her first night in Crescent City had been memorable. She spent the night in Helen's parlor in tense silence, waiting with Winnie, Danny, Seth, and Lanny as Helen labored in her room. The housekeeper, Abigail, attended to Helen. Polly had never been so excited and frightened. Her fatigue disappeared and so did her hunger. Finally, just before the crack of dawn, the baby was born. The moment a cry rung in the air was the most exhilarating time of her life. Relief spread in the parlor. Seth bolted into the room, and Lanny rushed after him. Polly clung to Winnie, sobbing with joy and relief. "Polly, what were you doing?" Winnie called out, and Polly returned to reality. "We have to go on time if we want to get back before nightfall." "I'm coming." Polly patted some carminic acid on her lips, dabbed some rose water on the inside of her wrist, and gave herself a thorough once-over. Her yellow dress was perfect for a nice long sunny afternoon. It complemented her skin tone well. She ran a hand through the ends of her hair. It was a bit hot, so she'd packed her hair up in a ponytail. With one last glance, she picked up her purse and strutted out of the room. Winnie was waiting in the living room with a frown. Her face lit up suddenly. "My, don't you look pretty? One would think you were going on a picnic with a gentleman." Polly did a little twirl. "Thank you, O married one. I shall have many a gentleman courting me soon, and many have wonderful picnics to attend," she said in a false, high-pitched voice. Winnie laughed. "One of the farmhands has offered to take us. We have to be back soon, or poor Danny would be grumpy if he doesn't get his dinner." She giggled. "The last time I got home later than usual, I met him trying to put a meal together," she grimaced. "It would have been a disaster if I hadn't arrived in time." Polly released a stream of laughter. She enjoyed these moments shared with her sisters, listening to their anecdotes about their marriage, reminiscing on the past, and watching the love between both couples. It always warmed her heart to see her elder sisters being cared for and cherished by such wonderful men. "We have to get some things for Helen. I've been shopping for her since she got too pregnant to go to town. Abigail always has her hands full with caring for Lanny." Winnie reached into her purse and unfolded a list. I don't think she'll need more flour. Or buttons. She looked up from the list to flash a smile at the farmhand. Thank you, George. Polly paused on the porch. The sight never ceased to amaze her. The farmhouse was a warm shade of brown, surrounded by a fractal of flowers in high bloom. The sun hung high in the sky, bathing the endless land in its warmth. Oh, to witness such beauty every day. No wonder Winnie looked so radiant. She'd give anything to wake up to a sight so wonderful every day. Polly, stop daydreaming and let's go. Polly quickly dashed down the steps and entered the carriage. Winnie was still glued to the list in her hand. I should have asked her what she needed yesterday. I was too busy gushing over Keith. Although the baby turned out to be a boy, not a girl like Polly hoped, she didn't mind at all. From the moment she held him in her arms, she was besotted. Keith was the perfect combination of Helen and Seth. She'd been so touched by his fragile beauty that tears had sprung to her eyes. Gosh, I still can't believe Helen is a mother. Annie and Minnie are too. She retrieved a letter from her purse. I wrote these last night. They'll be excited to hear about Helen's baby. Since we're so far apart, we have to keep in touch as often as we can. I wish we could all meet again, all of us. Polly sighed wistfully. The MacPherson sisters, together again. Winnie patted her hand. Someday. They said nothing more until they got to town. Polly was lost in the scenery. She hadn't been able to see much of it on her way from the station. She drank in the sights, reveling in the serenity of the grasslands. It had a quiet serenity about it. Back in Deadwood, the house she'd shared with Florence and Rose was situated next to other houses. They'd had neighbors close by, unlike Winnie's home, which was surrounded by nature. Not sure I can. Polly blinked. What? Should I knit Keith a sweater or sew him some clothes? Both. Winnie folded the list and tucked it into her purse. Perfect, we're all set. The carriage swerved into the town. Polly sat up. A few horses dotted the landscape, strolling lazily. A man stood watching them closely. The carriage moved past the livery. She scanned the surroundings, searching for the man she'd seen there a week before. Maybe this time she'd get to see his face. She held her breath, scanning the livery for any sign of him. There's the biggest livery stable in town, Winnie said, noticing her interest. She crinkled her nose. I never liked the smell of horses. Helen used to come here often before she got pregnant. Helen knows the owner? Winnie's face turned red. Yes, they're good friends. I'll tell you all about that later. Oh, look. She pointed at a small shop near the bank. That's the jeweler's shop, Winnie beamed. That's where Danny got my ring. She flashed her hand in front of her. Light bounced off the simple gold band. It's beautiful, Polly said genuinely. She listened as Winnie pointed out places, the blacksmith's, sheriff's office, the church, the bank, everywhere. The more of the town she saw, the greater her love for the town grew. It was a lot bigger than Deadwood, with more variety too, and a lot more people. This place is wonderful, Polly said when the brief tour was over. It is, isn't it? Winnie looked proud. They stopped at the general store. Winnie handed her a list. That's for us. I'll get whatever Helen needs. Pushing the door open, they entered the store. Winnie flashed a smile at the storekeeper. It's been a while, the middle-aged woman said. Haven't seen your sister in months. She's had a baby, Winnie said happily. A boy. The storekeeper gasped. That's wonderful news. She gestured to a shelf. Here, the baby will need these. Winnie followed her. Left to herself, Polly searched the store. It had everything, from books to kitchen utensils to farming equipment. The shelves were arranged in neat rows, each containing different items. A bolt of purple fabric caught her eye, and she hurried to a shelf containing clothing. Pretty colors lit up the whole place. She reached a hand out to touch the nearest one. The door opened several times and other people walked in. Polly was too engrossed in her exploring to notice them. Afterward, she scanned the list and started picking items off the shelves. She read the last item on the list. Coffee beans. Scanning the shelves, she searched for bags of coffee. There was none. Polly was about to give up when her eyes caught a small bag at the top of a shelf. She inched upwards on her toes, straining. Unfortunately, she hadn't inherited her sister's height. Do you need help? A deep voice said from somewhere behind her. Gasping, Polly swung back. She lost her balance and tumbled backward on unsteady feet. He lunged forward, grabbing her just in time. Strong arms braced her. Warmth spread through her, and her heart started to race. She stared up at him, taking in the clear lines of his face. Gray eyes held hers in a hypnotic gaze, rendering her breathless. His lips curved in a polite smile. Gently, he retrieved his arms from around her and took a step back. Heat crept up her cheeks. "Thank you." She smoothed her dress, hoping he wouldn't notice her shaking hands. "I'm usually not so clumsy." "I'm sure." "It's my fault. I didn't mean to startle you." How wonderfully polite, she thought, smiling at him. He managed to apologize and set her at ease at the same time. Polly racked her head for something to say. He was dressed completely in black, quite odd considering the heat. Wisps of blonde hair peeked out from underneath his hat. His eyes gleamed slightly. He moved closer. Her breath caught. What was he doing? He drifted a bit closer. Goodness, what did he think? He reached for the shelf and placed the coffee bag in her arms. Oh, of course. Heat crept up her cheeks. Why was she so flustered that a handsome stranger stood close to her? She stared at her feet, too mortified to hold his gaze. Did he know what she was thinking? "Do you need help with anything else?" "Air," she cleared her throat. "Nothing. Thank you." How she wished there was something else on Winnie's list. With a polite smile, he turned away from her. Polly watched him go. Her heart sinking. If only he'd stay a bit longer. But what would she say? The door shut. He'd gone. She didn't even know his name. Shaking off her disappointment, Polly grabbed all she'd bought and placed them on the counter. Winnie appeared at that moment, arms filled with fabric and sewing materials. "He's given us a discount. Helen would be thrilled." Winnie's grin faded, and her face took on an expression of concern. "What's wrong?" Polly sighed. Perhaps she hadn't been able to hide her disappointment as much as she thought. "What?" She cleared her throat and focused on arranging the items on the counter. "You're all flustered." Winnie raised a brow. Polly released a laugh. "I met a handsome gentleman." She blushed and looked away from her sister. Winnie chuckled. "Oh, Polly, there are lots of handsome men in Crescent City. I'm sure you'll find someone to your liking." Polly bit her lip, darting her gaze at the approaching storekeeper. Maybe she'd see him again. This time, she'd ask for his name. It was then that it dawned on her. He was the same man she'd seen heading into the livery. Polly's spirits rose. It couldn't be a mere coincidence that she'd seen him twice. Perhaps something wonderful would happen the third time. The third time's a charm. She'd meet the handsome stranger again. She was sure of it. Chapter 3. Phil darted a glance back at the store. He paused, waiting for the lovely brunette to come out. Surely she wouldn't stay inside forever? He'd never seen a woman look so lovely in a yellow dress. The way her cheeks had turned a warm rosy color when he'd neared her. He chuckled under his breath. Her reaction had amused him, but he'd managed to hide it. She was new in town. He'd never seen her around town before. Despite his aloofness, he recognized most of the townsfolk. Like everyone else, he always knew when someone moved to Crescent City. It wasn't just their faces, it was the way they carried themselves, as though they were exploring a place completely different from where they'd come from. It was the same way he'd carried himself when he arrived at the frontier. A few seconds later, he turned on his heel and left. It was foolish, standing outside the store waiting for a stranger to come out. What would he say to her when she did? Perhaps he'd compliment her on her dress. That'd surely bring a smile to her face. His thoughts drifted to Luke's sister, whom he'd met at the dinner. She was lovely, sweet too, although very shy. She'd barely looked him in the eye throughout the meal. He didn't know what to make of it. He'd pretended not to notice Luke's not-so-subtle attempts at matchmaking and the sly looks he shared with his wife. Afterward, Phil was thankful for the meal, and even more so for the company. He'd almost forgotten the bliss of sharing a meal with good company. He promptly forgot about Luke's sister-in-law. He had no desire to take it any further. Then he'd seen a stranger in a lovely yellow dress, and he'd been smitten. Phil shook his head, stacking his luggage on the horse. When was the last time he'd been immediately besotted by the sight of a woman? He could hardly remember. There was something oddly familiar about her, too. Mounting his horse, he started heading toward the livery. A man looked out of a carriage, then immediately turned his face away from the window. Phil froze. He scanned the man's profile, willing him to turn and face him, at the same time dreading it. The carriage passed. Discomfort snaked up his spine. Was he seeing things, or had Herman come for him? Realizing his horse had slowed, he urged the horse forward. Thoughts and images whirled in his head. It had taken just one glance at a stranger to resurface memories of the past he'd wanted to keep buried. Phil sucked in a breath. He was safe. He'd done a good job of hiding for a year, keeping his head low and minding his own business. Herman could never find him. Phil, he looked up to see a crowd gathered in front of the sheriff's office. Some of the men were cheering, others hurling insults at a man standing beside the sheriff with his hands tied. Phil slowed his horse to a stop. They'd found the outlaw. "No criminal goes unpunished. Not under my service," the sheriff said. He spoke with force, his voice rising above the crowd. "This man has wronged us. He will pay for his crimes." From a dozen feet away, Phil watched the scene. The men called for justice until the outlaw was led away. The sheriff made a statement about the judge arriving in town soon and how the criminal would be tried fairly. Finally, the crowd started to disperse. They moved with the assuredness that the man they'd tried so hard to find would be made to face his crimes. Phil scoffed. If only all criminals could be punished. So much could have been prevented. He wouldn't have been forced to run from the only home he'd known to a strange town, forced to rebuild his life from scratch. And he wouldn't be here looking over his shoulder and seeing Herman's face in every stranger. Most of all, he wouldn't have to bear the crushing weight of grief for the family that had been taken from him. Chapter 4. Is Keith awake? Polly embraced Helen with one arm while holding out a covered tray with the other. "I brought some cookies that I made myself. See?" Helen smiled. She looked better than 2 weeks before. Her rosy glow had returned, and her eyes were bright. "For the first time, Keith slept for most of the night. I haven't had a sleep so long in ages." She waved Polly in. "Thank you for the cookies. Keith would love them." The sisters laughed. Winnie came in soon after, holding a little dress she'd made. Helen gasped. "Is that a—" "Yes. I've been working on my knitting." Winnie beamed from ear to ear. Figured Keith would love a blue sweater. "Oh." Helen turned the sweater this way and that, her eyes lighting up with pleasure. "It's beautiful, Win. Absolutely lovely. Reminds me of Rose's tiny pink sweater when she was a baby. She loved it so much." She blinked rapidly. "Lanny will be jealous. She's been asking for a sweater ever since Seth got one for Keith." "You'd better hide it before she returns from school," Winnie said, lowering herself to a chair. "I can't make her one yet. The harvest is near, and that means many more hours in the kitchen. Danny's hired more farm hands." She released a groan. "That means more hungry men to cook for." "Thank goodness you have Polly," Polly grinned. "I made last night's dinner for the farm hands. They didn't complain, so I must have done something right." She gestured toward the room. "I'll check if Keith's awake." She crept into the room. Keith lay in his cot, sleeping peacefully. Polly's heart melted at the sight of him. He was so small, with a mass of dark hair and the tiniest fingers Polly had ever seen. His lips puckered slightly, and he made sucking motions with his mouth. Polly clasped a hand over her mouth to muffle her laugh so she wouldn't wake the baby. "So lovely," she cooed, smiling at the child. Keith's chest rose and fell with each breath. When Polly had admired her niece enough, she tiptoed out of the room. Her sisters were seated across each other. Helen had started munching on the cookies. "Stayed awake half the night 2 days ago trying to get him to sleep. Poor Seth had to get up by dawn to start work. I doubt Danny would have such patience. Well, I'll know soon enough." Silence. Helen gasped. You don't mean," Winnie beamed. "Yes, I think I'm pregnant." "That's amazing." Polly hurried over to Winnie's side and threw her arms around her. "I can't believe it. Another nephew or niece." The sisters broke into laughter. Winnie wiped a tear. "Oh, I'm overwhelmed with joy. You should have seen Danny when I told him. His eyes grew as wide as saucers, and he couldn't speak for a moment. Same thing Seth did. I like to say he was stunned into silence." Polly watched her sisters, her heart filling with joy at the love they'd found. She'd been thrilled for them when she'd read their letters detailing their newfound family. But now, experiencing it for herself was even more ecstatic. Nothing gladdened her heart more than knowing that all her sisters were happy with the homes they'd found. "A year from now, it could be you, Polly," Helen said, distracting her from her thoughts. "You could be off on a train to another town in a few months, excited about marrying a charming gentleman." Although she was smiling, sadness lurked beneath her words. She wasn't ready to let Polly go so soon. Polly grabbed her hand. "No, Helen, I don't want to leave you. I wish we'd never be separated again. I want to stay here, get married here, and raise my children here with you both. We'd have our weekly Sunday dinners with our husbands and children and attend functions together." A part of her couldn't help wishing she could have it all. Stay close to her sisters and have a home of her own. It had hurt to say goodbye to Florence and Rose. She couldn't bear to do that again. What if you fall in love with a man from another town? Helen's question gave her pause. The thought hadn't crossed her mind. She'd spent the last 2 weeks basking in the bliss of being reunited with her sisters, adjusting to life in a new town, and wondering if all was well with Florence and Rose. She hadn't thought to ponder too deeply on her marital future. If it came to it, what would she choose? The promise of matrimony in a new town, or staying with the family she'd known all her life? The next day, Polly embarked on a trip to town. She'd tossed and turned all night, mulling on Helen's question, and she'd come to a decision. She had no wish to be separated from her sisters. Never again. So there was only one option. She'd find a wonderful man to marry right here in Crescent City. She just had to. Surely, there was someone for her in such a thriving town. "We have enough foodstuff for the next 2 weeks. What do you need to get at the store?" Polly didn't respond. She waved at Winnie and hurried into the carriage. There was no time to explain to her. If she wished to marry someone in town, she had to leave the farm often, or else she'd be hidden. Winnie didn't attend social functions. Helen's husband was often invited, but Helen couldn't attend because she'd just had a baby. And Polly had no intention of waiting around until she could attend parties before finding a nice gentleman. She stopped at the store first. After engaging in small talk with the storekeeper, she browsed through the aisles, keeping an eye out for whoever walked in through the door. Mostly women trickled in. 2 women about her age entered the store, whispering to themselves. Snippets of conversation reached Polly's ears. "Be hanged for murder." "I heard he shot 7 men. 7. "Oh, Tessie, let's not speak of such horrid things. There's a medicine show in 2 days. Will you be there?" "Medicine show?" Polly blurted out. The women turned to her. One of them eyed her with interest. "That's a pretty dress. Where did you get the fabric?" Polly stared down at the blue dress Florence had gotten for her a year ago. "It's not from here. I'm from New Hampshire." The other woman flashed a warm smile. "There's a medicine show soon, and prize fighting too. That's next Friday. Will you come?" Polly was warmed by their friendliness. She returned the smile. "I'll try to." After they left, she couldn't stop smiling to herself. She'd made her very first friend in Crescent City. She started humming a tune, imagining the people she'd meet at the medicine show. There'd be many men, that was certain. She'd wear her loveliest dress and catch the eye of one of them. Maybe he'd be a rancher like Seth or a farmer like Danny. Or, she gasped, a jeweler. My, wouldn't that be thrilling? The door opened. A low voice made her heart start fluttering. It was familiar. She looked up, hoping it was the gentleman from last week. Her heart fell. It wasn't him. She waited a while longer, holding her breath whenever a man entered the store. Finally, Polly gave up. After paying for the few things she'd bought, she left the store and headed for the post office. She'd written a letter to Florence and Rose detailing the events that had transpired since her arrival in Crescent City. She met a short queue when she arrived. Stifling her impatience, she waited until she reached the front of the line. "Miss?" a low voice said from behind her. "You dropped this." Polly turned around to thank him. As she did, her breath caught. She stared into a set of familiar gray eyes. "You," she breathed, his lips spread in a grin. "You." Chapter 5. Phil had never been more glad to see someone. The surprise on her face morphed into a smile, and she quickly looked away. He held out one of the letters she'd dropped. "Is this yours?" She nodded. "Thank you." Then she turned away from him without saying another word. As he stood behind her, he caught a whiff of the scent of her hair. Flowers and soft rain, he mused, recalling a line from a poem he'd once read. After she'd dropped her letters with the postman, he stopped her. Wait. What was he doing? He hadn't thought this through at all. Her eyes held his, waiting. Would you like to see my livery? Immediately after the words left him, he wanted to slap himself. What an odd thing to say to a woman he'd only met twice. And he didn't even know her name, he muttered under his breath, appalled at himself for being so disorganized in his approach. Never had he been so flustered. He always planned ahead. To his surprise, she smiled. Her eyes sparkled. That would be lovely. I want to see as much of the town as I can. He had a few meetings lined up. First, he had to see the sheriff about the man that had stolen one of his horses. Then he needed to visit the bank. But Phil wasn't thinking of those things. For the first time, they didn't matter so much. Instead, he found himself grinning at her, almost as pleased as the day he'd bought his first horse. Wonderful. Moments later, he led her on a stroll down the street. She was taking in her surroundings with the excitement of a new immigrant. I didn't see all these last week. She pointed at a red brick building. What's that? The courtroom. A trial is ongoing. Oh, I heard some of the townsfolk talking about it. She looked up at him. I took a tour of the town with my sister last week. I suppose there's only so much that can be seen from inside a carriage. And then it dawned on Phil. He didn't know her name. The realization shocked and embarrassed him. The first time he'd seen her, he'd been so enthralled that he hadn't thought to give a proper introduction. Again, he'd made the same mistake. Where were his manners? Phil wished he could shake himself. It was so unlike him to forget such important things. He cleared his throat. I'm embarrassed to admit. We don't know each other's names, she giggled. Her eyes danced with mirth. Believe me, I don't often follow strangers to see their livery stables. He released a peal of laughter. I'm Phil. Polly. They shook hands. And it's true. There's only so much you can see from inside a carriage. The familiar stench of hay and horse dung waxed stronger in the air as they neared the livery. She pointed at the horses scattered across the fields. Are those yours? No, they belong to some men staying at a nearby inn. My workers have to feed, house, and exercise the horses every day. Would you like to see mine? Oh, yes, I have a sister who loves horses. I've only touched one a few times. I've never ridden one. I'm afraid I'd fall off. She giggled. Phil's lips curved upward. She was so childlike in her appreciation of the things around her. It was beguiling. She watched the horses, her eyes lighting up in awe. Is that horse wounded? She clasped a hand over her mouth. Oh, the poor thing. Phil had a strong urge to soothe her worry. Her eyes were filled with concern as though she could feel the horse's pain. He's getting better. Horses are quite resilient. He gestured toward the store. Would you like to meet mine? Polly's face lit up. She glanced around her, a small smile on her face as she scanned the environs. The workers looked up. On seeing her, their conversation died. They glanced at Phil, with shock evident on their features. There was a question on their faces. Phil ignored them and turned to Polly. He led her into the stall. His horse, Raven, neighed softly. Phil stroked her mane, whispering to her. I'd like you to meet someone. He beckoned to Polly. Polly reached a hand out. He's beautiful. When her hand touched his coat, she giggled. I saw him the day I arrived in town. Really? And you too. She blushed and looked away. I thought he was a majestic horse. What did you think of me? The words left his lips before he could think about them. Polly peered at him from beneath her lashes. Never mind. Phil waved it off. You don't know me. Yet he found himself curious about her. What did she think of him? Did she think him bold, charming, or did she think nothing at all? Her eyes held his, and he was pulled into the endless depths of her gaze. Who was this beautiful stranger, and why did she captivate him so? She moved her head slightly. A few strands of hair lay at the side of her face, begging for him to touch. His gaze dropped to her lips, full, a cherry-red color. Polly jerked her hand back from the horse, breaking the spell. She giggled. I think he's hungry. He was nuzzling my palm. Or maybe he just likes you. Polly's smile was the sweetest thing he'd ever seen. How do you know? Horses are easy to understand, unlike people. His expression turned hard. He'd spent all his life around people, yet he hadn't mastered the art of knowing their motives. He'd dined with men adorned by wealth and power, men who, by society's standards, were good, men that had graced his home for a visit, who'd spent many hours conversing with the man that had been his father. They'd shared drinks, meals, and experiences. Still, he had been blinded to the evil lurking beneath their smiles, and it had cost him. Horses are loyal. They stay true to their owners till the very end. Reaching for a pail behind the door, he retrieved an apple and held it out to Raven. I spend a lot of my time with horses. It's easier. Polly was silent for a long minute. Did someone betray you? Phil stilled. He kept his gaze fixated on the horse, watching him chew the crust, silence stretched. What would he say? He'd gotten so carried away that he hadn't bothered to watch what he was saying. But then, he seldom spoke to people. The most he endured was small talk with the more persistent townsfolk. He hadn't let anyone into his thoughts in a long, long while. Phil faked a smile. I spend a lot of time with horses, Polly nodded. That explains it. Her smile slipped. I told George I'd meet him in front of the store soon. I don't have much time left. Who? He's one of my brother-in-law's farmhands. She emitted a soft sigh. I wish I had more time. For the first time in ages, Phil wasn't looking forward to the end of the conversation. He could let her leave and hope they'd stumble into each other again. But how sure was he that he'd be lucky? What if she left town and he never saw her again? He hadn't enjoyed someone else's company so much in a while, only Helen's, but she'd been so occupied since she got married that they seldom spent time together. He ought to visit her soon. He only hoped Winnie wouldn't be there. It was still awkward seeing the woman he'd almost married with another man, even if he hadn't loved her. If you don't mind me asking, where do you live? Maybe I'll pay you a visit. Polly's face brightened. That would be wonderful. I am staying with my sister, the Kenton ranch. The Quentons? He cursed under his breath. No wonder she was familiar. He was smitten by Winnie's sister. Polly cocked her head. Is there a problem? Phil exhaled through pursed lips. A few months ago, I almost married your sister. Polly's face paled. What? Chapter 6. The journey home was a blur. Polly stared into thin air, shocked by what she'd just heard. The first time she'd taken an interest in a man, he'd turned out to be her sister's almost groom. It took a Herculean effort to clamp the urge to blurt out questions immediately after she returned home. Luckily, Winnie wasn't in the house. Polly headed straight for her room, curled up on her bed, and mulled over the turn of events. Phil's handsome face continued resurfacing in her mind's eye. He was so breathtaking. She'd never been drawn to anyone so much, and in such a short time, too. It made no sense. Why was she so attracted to a man she barely knew? Polly's heart got heavier. Questions swirled in her head. Why had Phil not married her sister? What had happened between them? Had Winnie made a huge discovery that made him unsuitable to be her groom? The last question was the most nerve-wracking of all. Perhaps Phil had somehow exhibited a trait that made Winnie end the betrothal, or they just hadn't been a good match. How could she explain being attracted to the man that had almost married her sister? Polly? Polly sat up. She glanced around her. The sun was setting. The warm colors of sunset trickled into her room, lighting up the soft yellow walls. She hugged her knees to her chest and lay her head on her clasped palms. She could try to forget all about her encounter with Phil, which would be difficult. Or she could find out why he hadn't married Winnie. Yes, that's exactly what I'll do. If nothing else, she'd have clarity. That would be enough. Are you asleep? Polly cleared her throat and softened her features. No, I'm awake. Winnie entered the room with a radiant smile. Danny and I just went to visit the new family that moved into the farm close to us. They have 8 children, all girls. She sat on the bed. Reminds me of us. Her expression turned wistful. She released a long sigh. Oh, how I long for those days. Our childhood was quite fun, wasn't it? Despite Polly's mood, she couldn't help cracking a smile. Father used to say he was blessed to have a home filled with little women. The room went silent. Polly's chest constricted, and tears clouded her eyes. Although the pain had dulled with time, she often had the urge to cry whenever she remembered their father. He'll be so pleased to see us now, happy, thriving in our homes with our new families. I'm sure he'll be proud. Seeing the perfect opening, Polly dove in. You once mentioned in your letter that you almost married someone else. Oh, that. Winnie released a short laugh. It's a funny story, really. It all happened at the hotel upon my arrival in town. She shifted on the bed, clasped her hands, and angled herself so she was facing Polly. I'd just entered the hotel when the clerk called a man's name, Mr. Quentin. You see, I was flustered because I'd traveled to Crescent City to marry Helen's friend, Mr. Kenton. Polly frowned. What? Exactly. Winnie threw her hands up. An easy mistake, isn't it? Danny's surname is spelled with a Q. Phil's is Ken. Polly nodded. Ah, I see it now. A few seconds passed. So, why didn't you marry Phil? Winnie exhaled through pursed lips. We weren't right for each other. We courted for a few weeks, but I never really got to know him at all. But then, I was so drawn to Danny that there'd have been little space for something to blossom. I'm not sure. She shrugged. It never felt right with Phil, even though Helen thought we'd be a good match. She glanced out the window and shot to her feet. We should start preparing dinner. Was there something wrong with him? Winnie frowned. Who? Phil? She paused at the doorway. Although he was gentlemanly, his heart wasn't open. She shrugged. Or maybe I was too besotted with another man to notice. Polly stayed in the room for a few minutes after Winnie left. She wasn't quite sure what to make of Winnie's words. What did she mean by Phil's heart not being open? Was he incapable of loving someone? Was there something in his past that had shut him off from bonding? Her thoughts moved to the statement he'd made about horses always staying loyal. She'd suspected a hidden meaning behind his words, a revelation of some kind. Polly, are you coming? Polly rose from the bed. Whoever Phil was, she'd have to find out on her own. She couldn't just give up without trying. Polly kept her worries hidden all through. She laughed and spoke with Winnie, as she always did. It was when she was finally alone with her thoughts that her strongest worry echoed. Was she falling in love with the wrong man? Polly didn't say a word about Phil for days. It ate at her. How could she hide such a thing from her own sister? It was ludicrous. She told herself to banish all thoughts of him from her mind, focus on spending time with her family, and later she'd find a husband. But she couldn't. Thoughts of him plagued her. She couldn't help wondering, what if? What if she and Phil could have the happily ever after her sisters had? What if he was good for her? She could have it both ways, her own love story and not getting separated from her sisters. They could be one big happy family. Then another realization reared its head. What if Winnie revolted against the idea of her being courted by Phil? The questions swirled in her thoughts, over and over again, until she was exhausted. Winnie made some observations about her being distracted, but Polly just covered it up with a smile and a shrug. Finally, she couldn't bear it anymore. How long could she hide such an important matter from her sister? I met Phil, she blurted out one morning after breakfast. Huh. I met Phil at the store when we went for a tour of the town. He helped me get the coffee beans because it was out of my reach, and... Whoa, Winnie chuckled. Slow down, Polly. What's this about? And then he invited me to his livery to meet his horse. Winnie cocked her head. His horse? Polly nodded. Yes, it's a lovely horse. Very majestic. Winnie narrowed her eyes. Huh. Polly threw her hands up. He wants to court me, all right? At least, I think he did because he asked to pay a visit. Then I mentioned the Quentin farm, and that's when he found out we're sisters. Winnie stared at her for a long moment. Polly looked away, fiddling with her fingers. Gosh, this was ridiculous. Why did she feel like she'd been caught doing something wrong? She hadn't done anything. He hadn't even... You're attracted to him. It wasn't a question. Polly shut her eyes briefly and sucked in a breath. Yes. Winnie paused thoughtfully. I see. Standing, she packed the dishes and headed for the kitchen. Polly stared after her wordlessly. What was Winnie thinking? Did she disapprove? Had she gotten closer to Phil than she'd said? Look, Win, I do find him interesting. I think he's a gentleman, and I feel comfortable around him. I just wanted to tell you about this before anything happens. Winnie stood with her back to her as she cleaned the dishes. You asked me if I'd choose to leave you and Helen to move to another town and get married. I don't want to do that. I want to stay here in Crescent City, get married, and have children too. I don't want us to be separated again. Winnie said nothing for a while. Polly smoothed her dress repeatedly, holding her breath. Although she wished it wasn't the case, whatever Winnie said next would determine if she'd let Phil court her or not. How could she be with a man her sister didn't approve of? Still, wouldn't Winnie want her to be happy? With a muffled clatter, Winnie dropped the plates on the counter. She reached for a napkin, wiped her hands, and turned to Polly. "This is what you want, isn't it?" Polly bit her lip. "Yes," Winnie nodded. "All right." Polly flashed a hesitant smile. "Really?" "I can't tell you what to do, Polly. You're a grown woman, even if it's still taking some time to get used to it. I'm still not sure this is the right decision, but I trust you'll make the right choice." Polly rushed forward and flung her arms around Winnie. "I can't wait to tell him," Winnie sighed. "No, Polly, let him come after you. That's the only way you'll know if he truly wants you." Chapter 7. He should stay away. Phil told himself to. After all, he had no reason to believe Polly would be interested in him now that she'd learned the truth. He ought to leave her be. Perhaps she'd arrived in Crescent City for the same reason as Winnie, to find a man to marry. But then, why can't that man be me? Despite his attempts at staying away, Phil couldn't. Polly's sweet face haunted him all through the day, every single day. He overheard some of the workers conversing amongst themselves about the day he'd brought a young woman to the livery. A week after their meeting, he summoned the courage and rode to the Kenton farm. He didn't let himself question his decision until he got to the farm. He and Winnie had parted ways on good terms. Surely she wouldn't be bothered about his interest in her sister? If she found the notion disconcerting, he'd assure her of his honorable intentions towards Polly. He was drawn to Polly, and his interest in her wasn't born of a sense of duty. To his surprise, Winnie received him courteously. After the first visit, the rest became easier. He left the livery earlier 3 times a week to spend evenings with Polly. Sometimes they took a long stroll. Other times he helped her mount his horse and held the reins while the horse trotted beside him. The more time he spent with Polly, the more he was drawn to her. She laughed easily, and she made him laugh. Soon his workers started noticing the change in him. Luke made humorous comments, asking when next he'd bring his new lady friend to the livery. Phil just laughed and waved it off. Now, Phil strode toward the house holding a bunch of flowers. He loved the way her eyes lit up whenever he gave her the flowers. And then she'd smile so sweetly at him that his heart would dance happily. This time, when he knocked on the door, it wasn't Polly that answered. "Howdy," he said awkwardly, flashing a polite smile at Winnie. Winnie's expression was cool. She returned his smile, although it didn't reach her eyes. She inched the door open slightly, but she didn't make further moves to let him in. "Is Polly in?" Winnie eyed him. She finally nodded after a long silence. "All right, I'll let her know." She stepped back. "Please come in." Phil's relief immediately morphed into discomfort when she sat across from him in the living room. He rarely saw Winnie during his visits, and she'd never stay in the same room with him. The minutes ticked by in uncomfortable silence. He'd never imagined he'd be in this kind of situation, needing to convince the woman he'd almost married to let him court her sister. It would have been laughable if it wasn't so awkward. A nervous chuckle. "You go first," Phil said. "My sister's a sweet girl. She feels things deeply, sometimes too deeply." Phil heard the subtle warning in her words. "I won't hurt her." Winnie nodded. "Ah, would you like anything?" Phil declined politely. Winnie left the parlor. He tapped his feet on the ground, counting the minutes until Polly's appearance. Winnie had been civil with him. Polite, too, albeit suspicious. They were off to a good start. Phil looked up. His breath caught. Polly was clad in an orange dress, and she'd let her hair loose. Her eyes were bright, lighting up with a smile. "Sunset," he muttered, admiring the colors of her dress. Different shades of orange. "What? That's a lovely dress." Polly blushed. "Thank you." She took the flowers from him. "And these flowers are lovely." She placed the flowers in a vase and hurried back to him. "Shall we?" She flashed him a smile, and warmth spread through him. She skipped down the porch toward his horse. Phil stood watching her. Her easy laughter floated into his ears. She glanced back and beckoned him. "Come, I'll show you the stream." They walked in silence for a while. "I spoke with Winnie." "What did she say?" Phil paused. It's hard to tell if Winnie's all right with this. She's protective of you. Polly reached for a nearby flower, plucked it, and raised it to her nose. She shut her eyes briefly, inhaling deeply. The forest was calm. Light seeped in through the tree branches, hitting the side of her face. It was a picturesque view. At that moment, Phil wished he could paint. She looked so peaceful, holding a flower to her nose with her eyes closed. Then she opened them and the serenity disappeared. I think what matters to her are your intentions. He reached for her other hand. It was soft and small in his. Drifting closer, he entwined their hands. I thought I'd made my intentions very clear. I wish to court you properly for a while. He inched a hand up to her face. I have never been so besotted by a woman, and I've met quite a number of them. Polly's smile was a reward on its own. She tilted her chin upward, staring at him with shining eyes. Phil inched closer, her eyes closed and her lashes rested prettily on her cheeks. Her face cooked closer to his. Her lips parted. Wings fluttered above them. Polly jerked back. She released a nervous laugh. I'd never have come here alone. She turned and ran away from him. Come. Phil hurried after her. Where? Polly turned and beckoned to him. The chuckle of a stream reached his ears. She sat on a fallen log, picked up a pebble, and threw it into the water. I hope to someday bring Keith here when he's older. I think he'll love it. She smiled. Helen had Keith on the night I arrived. It was beautiful. When I held him, I couldn't help imagining how I'd feel when I hold my child in my arms. She threw another pebble into the water. Do you like children? Phil slipped his hand into his pocket. I was once a child. His response seemed to displease her. She frowned, turned the flower in her hands, and started pulling off the petals. Phil didn't know what to think. Had he said something wrong? Where are you from? She asked suddenly. When he said nothing, she added, I ought to know some things about you. New York, he said flatly. A familiar unease was creeping up his back. He crossed his arms, staring out at the stream. Why did you leave New York? Phil raised a shoulder in a casual shrug. His throat was starting to close up. He scratched his neck, fighting a grimace. He'd avoided these questions from the chatty townsfolk. Everyone wanted to befriend the new arrivals and spend sunny afternoons swapping stories about their past. That was one reason why he'd stayed away from the tavern. It wasn't the sort of company he was used to. For greener pastures, he finally said, hoping she'd leave it at that. Why was she questioning him anyway? Well, I left home because I had to. After my father died, my cousin took over all he owned and started trying to force us to do his bidding. We left when we discovered he'd accumulated a lot of debt. He's sold the house. Sadness coated every word she uttered. She stared at the crumpled petals in her hands. We would never have traveled to the frontier if things had remained the same, if tragedy hadn't struck. Phil moved closer to her. I'm sorry for your loss, Polly. Sometimes tragic incidents veer us off the path we think we'd tread to another path entirely. A redirection. Polly's eyes bored into his. What tragic incident redirected you? Phil's throat closed up. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Polly searched his gaze, waiting. Phil said nothing. What would he say? That he'd fled New York? That although he'd committed no crime, he sometimes looked over his shoulder out of fear that he was being hunted. And just like that, he was sucked into the past. William's sickly face flashed in his mind. Usually a vibrant person, William had become a shadow of himself during the days of his illness. It was a loss Phil couldn't bear. William had taken him in, treated him as a son, and raised him. He'd taught him about life, people, and business. Then he'd been stabbed in the back by the same people he'd trusted. After losing a huge part of his wealth in a business deal cooked up by his brother, William fell ill. Phil watched life seep away from the person he loved the most. Just before William died, he passed on something important to Phil, a family heirloom that William's brother had always wanted. And Phil ran. The darkness of the past threatened to overwhelm him. Phil shot to his feet, putting some distance between him and Polly. He turned toward the stream. The sight of the water flowing gently downstream, sliding over rocks, and following a set path gradually drew his thoughts from the past. He hated thinking about it. It was something he'd tried not to do over the past year. Phil? Polly inched closer to him. She touched his shoulder. Are you all right? Tell me what's on your mind. He shook his head. I can't. His chest tightened. "I'll walk you to the house so it's getting dark." No words were exchanged on the walk back. Phil was buried in his thoughts. No one had ever come so close to forcing him to think about New York. Most of the time, he could convince himself he'd left it all behind and focused on getting through each day. But now, why had Polly asked anyway? "Will you visit again?" Polly asked when they'd reached the house. Concern shone in her eyes. Phil took a step back and inclined his head in a nod. "I will." He waited till she'd entered the house before mounting his horse and riding away. Chapter 8. Polly watched him through the window until he disappeared from view. Afterward, she sank onto a chair, deflated. How could her heart be full and empty at the same time? The look in his eyes when he'd held her gaze, the tenderness in his features, it all came rushing back. Warmth flooded her, and she suddenly felt giddy. He'd wanted to kiss her. If she hadn't been startled by the birds, would he have kissed her? Or would he have held back for fear of being too hasty? She wrapped her arms around herself. How could his mood have changed in such an instant? Whatever lay in his past, he didn't want to tell her about it. The uncertainty was terrifying. Who was he, and what was he hiding from? Polly buried her head in her hands. She didn't know whether to sob or smile. First, she'd been worried about her sister's approval. Now it was him she worried about. Why wouldn't he open up to her? The door opened and Winnie entered holding a tray. "I assume you had a good time?" Polly felt the urge to run into her sister's arms and weep, but she held herself back. "Yes," Polly choked out. She did have a good time. At least she did before the question about his past. "Did you ask him questions?" Winnie placed the tray on the table. "Has he told you about his past?" "He's from New York." Polly had the urge to defend him. She wasn't a child. She knew what she was doing. She wouldn't court a man without being aware of his past. Winnie shot her a leveled look. "And?" Polly bit her lip. Why was Winnie speaking to her like she was a child? Winnie released a long sigh. "He didn't tell you, did he?" "Not yet." "Oh, Polly, this won't do at all. Maybe it's too soon. He'll tell me." "By then you'll be so in love with him that you'd be blinded by your affection." "Whatever it is, it must be painful for him. I can't force him to tell me what he's not willing to share." "You'd rather marry a stranger?" "He's not a—" "Polly?" Winnie's voice softened. "You're letting your emotions blind you. I know I told you I wouldn't make decisions for you, but I can't watch you hurt yourself. What if he turns out to be someone completely different from who you think he is? What if he's running from something? You can't love a man you don't know, Polly." Polly bit the inside of her cheek, fuming silently. She wasn't a child anymore. She could make her own choices. And she would. Why was Winnie trying to convince her not to be with Phil anyway? "Maybe the past is too painful for him to talk about. It's only been a few weeks, Win. I can't know everything in such a short time." Winnie sat closer to her. She placed a hand on Polly's shoulder. "I just want you to be careful. Falling in love is a risk that can only be worthwhile if you're with the right man. And I don't think Phil is that man." After that statement, all the fight left Polly. She placed her head on her palms and wept. Winnie embraced her. "It's all right, Polly. You'll be all right." She patted her back, muttering soothing words. "If he wants you, he'll open his heart to you. He won't hide the truth." Sniffling, Polly wiped her tears. "I'm silly, aren't I? Crying over a man I've known so briefly." Winnie stroked her hair fondly. "You're not silly at all. You're pure and open-hearted. You deserve someone equally as open-hearted as you." Polly sank into her sister's embrace. Although her heart hurt, she was comforted with the thought that no matter what happened, she'd always have her sisters to return home to. Polly tried keeping thoughts of Phil out of her mind. She spent her days assisting Winnie with preparing meals, going to the store, and talking to the townsfolk. Each time she went to the town, she hoped and dreaded running into Phil. After mulling over her sister's words, she had to admit her sister was right. She shouldn't be too hasty to get attached to a man she knew so little of. If he eventually told her the truth about who he was, she'd reconsider. If not, she hoped with all her heart that he would. Polly paused to brace herself outside the house. So far, this was the largest house she'd seen in Crescent City. The murmur of conversation drifted outside, merging with the sounds of arriving carriages. Someone stepped out next to her. The scent of perfume hung heavily in the air, accompanied by the sound of giggling. Polly's eyes widened, the women she'd spotted at the store weeks ago. They paused when they saw her. "You came, let's go in." Polly smiled at them, relieved. Although she'd been excited to attend her first party in Crescent City, she was also nervous. She was so accustomed to going out with her sisters that being by herself in a room full of strangers was very unnerving. Winnie had wanted to be there, but she felt ill. Polly smoothed her dress, sucked in a breath, and followed the women. The atmosphere was relaxed and inviting. Everyone chatted heartily amongst themselves. A dark-haired woman approached them with her arms spread. "Welcome. You're Helen's sister, aren't you?" she asked after greeting them. "I can see the resemblance. Come, there are some people I'd like you to meet." Before the end of the hour, Polly's cheeks were hurting. Names blurred in her head. Who knew there were so many people in Crescent City? She met kind older women who were eager to matchmake her with their sons and had a wonderful time sharing laughs with women her age. As the evening passed, the knot in her chest eased. Winnie was right to encourage her to attend the party alone. There was only so much she could do on the farm. After doing the chores, she'd found herself staring out the window, waiting for Phil to visit. "Polly." Polly froze. That was Phil. She couldn't have imagined it. Bracing herself, she turned to face him. Phil was clad completely in black, just like the first day she'd seen him. He closed the distance between them. "I couldn't find you at home. Winnie told me where you were." He glanced around the room. Polly squished her brows. Her initial surprise had given way to curiosity. Why was he so uncomfortable? "Can we go outside?" "Mr. Kenton," Mrs. Miller said, beaming from ear to ear as she approached them. "What a surprise!" She turned to Polly. "I can't count the number of times I've invited Phil over for dinner. He always prefers the company of his horses to people." She laughed easily, seeming completely unoffended. "Yet here you are today. What brings you here?" "Polly," Phil said simply. Mrs. Miller glanced from Phil to Polly. Her eyes widened as it sunk in. Oh, I see." She flashed Polly a knowing smile. "I'll have to dissuade my son then." Phil clasped a hand over Polly's. Her breath caught. Already, all her inhibitions were melting. She should stay here at the party, making new friends and conversing with interesting gentlemen. How could she choose to stay with a man that wasn't willing to open up to her? Yet, she found herself following him, her skin tingling where he touched her. Phil strode purposefully out of the room, his hand clasped firmly on her, as though he was claiming her in front of everyone else. Eyes trailed them as they left the party. He led her away from the entrance of the house to a patch of grassland several feet away. "What happened the last time?" He inhaled deeply. "I have never told anyone about New York. The one thing I've always wanted is to forget completely about the past. It's too painful." Polly reached a hand out to touch his face. "I just want to know who you are, Phil. I want you to open up to me. Let me in." Phil's gaze bored into hers. Seconds passed. He exhaled audibly, placed his hand on hers, and started stroking her fingers. "I'll tell you," he finally said. Polly felt a weight drop from her shoulders. Finally, she'd know who Phil Kenton was. 7%. Chapter 9. The words stuck in his throat, and he took a moment to brace himself. For so long, he'd kept everything about his past private. No one knew where he was from or who he'd been. To the townsfolk, he was the quiet livery owner who kept to himself and never did more than exchange polite greetings. Until now, that had been enough for him. The last time he'd seen Polly, he'd started rethinking his decision to keep the past in the past. It wasn't enough for Polly to spend time with him without asking about the man he'd been. She'd told him about her past, her father's death, how her sisters had been forced to leave their homes for the frontier, and the pain of losing the home she'd been raised in. Wasn't it unfair to her if he kept everything about himself locked away beyond her reach? He could either open up or risk losing Polly. "My parents died when I was a child. I can't remember their faces. I was taken in by a wealthy man soon after they died. My father used to work for him. He had no family of his own, so he raised me as his son." Memories of his childhood resurfaced. William used to remind him of how quiet and withdrawn he'd been as a boy, before he'd bloomed into a happy child. William was patient and kind, hiring a governess to tutor him and spending leisurely Saturday mornings with him in the stables. William taught him all he knew about horses. That was how his love for horses began. When he was old enough, he started learning how to ride. Saturday mornings began with a leisurely ride through the surrounding fields and always ended in a race. The day he beat William at the race, William slapped him on the shoulder and titled him a fine horseman. He was the only family I had. He never hid his love for me. Everywhere we went, he introduced me as his own son. His lips curved in a wistful smile. William had never been a man who hid his affection. His love and devotion for family eventually blinded him to the tricks of his envious family. Then he died, Polly gasped. Tears filled her eyes. Oh, Phil. Phil turned away from her. Even now, a year after the incident, the pain was as heavy as the very day it had happened. It had been such a shock. It happened too quickly. One day, William was agile, riding with him on a chilly Saturday morning and talking about how excited he was about the deal his brother had propositioned. The next, he was in bed, life draining quickly out of him. He was an influential man, loved and admired by many. He never hesitated to help all those who reached out to him. He'd inherited his business from his father, then he expanded it over decades. What happened? Polly asked softly. His brother, Herman. They were close, or so I thought. He proposed a business deal, which William agreed to. We found out too late that it was a con. William lost half the wealth he'd struggled to build. The loss weakened him, and his heart couldn't bear it. He passed away after a few days. Polly's eyes shone with tears. She grasped his hands. I'm so sorry, Phil. Losing a loved one is painful. A pause. Is that why you left? Herman took everything. Polly wrapped her arms around him. He eased into her embrace, letting her comfort him. Phil gritted his teeth, feeling the pain of injustice that had almost crushed him a year ago. Herman had been all too eager to step in and take control of William's wealth. It seemed as if he'd been waiting for that moment for a long time. Herman had tricked William into a con, hoping to cart away half of his wealth. Then he'd gotten lucky, and the shock had killed William. William had realized it too late. Hours before he died, he gripped Phil's hand and said some things that had shocked him. I thought he was over this, William forced out. What? Herman never forgave me for being the chosen one. Our father... He paused to catch his breath. Our father handed the reins of the business to me not just because I'm the first son, but because I showed more interest in learning. Herman never did. When Father died, he cussed at me and said no matter what he did, he'd never gained Father's approval. He despised me for owning the owl. The owl? Phil asked, mystified. What did the silver owl sitting in William's study have to do with Herman's resentment? William forced his eyes open. Yes, that was Father's greatest treasure from his earlier shipping expeditions. He cherished it. All who knew him knew of his fondness for the silver owl. Before he died, he passed it on to me. Herman hated me for it. According to him, it was the ultimate sign of Father's approval. I thought he'd forgotten all about it. Phil suffered through the days after William's death, accepting condolences while anger simmered in his gut. Herman played the part of the grieving brother well. He took charge of the funeral arrangements and completely ignored Phil's existence. Later, he made his intentions for Phil very clear. Get out of my house. No matter how often William presented you to the world as his son, you were never his. You have no say in anything. Angry and grieving, Phil took everything he had, including a sum of money he'd saved over time, and left New York. It was hard enough staying in the same city with the man that was responsible for William's death. Everyone assumed William died of a weak heart, but no one knew the cause. How could they believe his scheming brother was the root of it all? So, to spite Herman, Phil had taken the last thing William had given him, the silver owl, the one thing Herman wanted above all else, a sign of his father's approval. Phil's heart was surprisingly light after he spoke to Polly. He'd borne the weight of William's death for so long that he'd become accustomed to the heaviness. Letting someone in had eased his burden somewhat. He'd never forget the hurt of losing the family he'd had, or forgive the man that had caused his death. But he could move on to create the life he needed. A family of his own. A fresh start. After he'd ensured Polly was safely home, He returned to the livery for the rest of the evening. As always, he was the last to leave the livery. After checking that the animals were secure, he started his journey home. He passed by Luke's house. The hearty laughter made him smile. Soon, his house will be filled with warmth and the happy laugh of a beautiful woman. He'd make Polly his wife. No other woman was for him. She made him laugh. Her childlike wonder inspired him to look at the world in awe. Her presence had opened up parts of his heart he never knew existed. Soon he'd have the jeweler make the perfect ring. Then they'd get married in the little church. From here on out, everything would go smoothly. The back of his neck started prickling. Footsteps thudded behind him. He glanced back. There was nothing but shadows. Phil walked up to his porch. He was about to open the door when something caught his eye. A letter. Raising it up, he unfolded it. There were no words. Instead, a drawing of an animal. His blood ran cold as he stared at the image. Phil recognized it all too well. An owl. Chapter 10. The sound of hooves approaching the house prompted Polly out of bed. She dashed out of the room to the parlor, then paused to peer out the window. Her heart plummeted. It wasn't Phil, but one of the farmhands. Polly sank to a seat, her chest constricting. She didn't understand. What was going on? The last time they'd been together, they'd made progress. He'd opened up to her. For the very first time, he'd let her see him as more than a charming and successful man who had it all together. She'd returned home excited about what their future would look like. He'd promised to stop by the next day so they'd have a picnic, but he hadn't shown up. Days passed, and there was no sign of Phil. Now a week had gone by, and he still hadn't visited her. Polly buried her face in her hands. A sob welled up in her throat. Someone knocked on the door. Sucking in a breath, she answered the door. "For Mrs. Kenton," the farmhand said, holding out a missive. Polly stared at it with disinterest. Forcing a grateful smile, she took it from him, shut the door, and went in search of her sister. Winnie was seated in her room, humming a tune. She held a ball of yarn, her brows furrowed in concentration. "A few weeks ago, I was knitting a sweater for Keith. I had no idea I'd soon start another for my baby." She placed a hand on her flat stomach, a smile curving her lips. "I can't explain the joy and excitement I feel. Is it a boy or a girl? Will my child look like Danny or me or both? Keith sure managed that." "I know you'll be a wonderful mother," Polly said, extending a hand. "A letter for you." Winnie looked up with interest. "Maybe it's from Minnie." Her eyes lit up. "It is. Oh, this is wonderful. I can't wait to know what she's been up to. We have to ensure we stay in touch as often as we can, you know. Have you replied to Rose's letter?" Polly flopped on the bed. "I haven't been in the mood to." Winnie placed the letter on the table, dropped her yarn, and turned her full attention on Polly. "I've seen you moping around the house. You're sad he hasn't come to visit, aren't you?" Polly bit her lip. "I know he'll visit." "Polly, I don't think—" "No, Win, I know you don't fancy him much, but he's a good man. He's charming and kind, and he cares about me." Winnie reached for her hands. "Listen." Polly shot to her feet, shaking her head. "No, I know what you'll say. You'll tell me I should have listened to you at the start." Tears stung her eyes. Releasing a shuddering breath, she blinked rapidly. She wouldn't cry. Not in front of Winnie. If she gave in to the urge to cry, that'd be the same as admitting defeat. That her sister had been right all along. "The last time I saw him, he told me everything. He looked for me and told me everything about his past. He finally opened up to me. That means something, doesn't it? So why has he suddenly disappeared?" Tears blinded her eyes. Sobs racked through her. "Oh, Polly." Winnie wrapped her arms around her. "It hurts me to see you like this. You're soft-hearted, perhaps the most soft-hearted of us all. You're so eager to see the good in others, even when they don't see it." Polly sniffled. "That's what Father always said." "Now, listen to what I'm about to say. I know what you'll say. I should forget all about him and meet other people. You always thought he's not the right man for me." Winnie stepped back, breaking the embrace. "Oh, no, absolutely not. I wasn't going to say that." Polly frowned. "You weren't? Don't spend days here crying and waiting for him, Polly. Walk up to him and ask why he's staying away. Whatever happens, at least you'll know where you stand with him." Polly stared at her sister in disbelief. Had she heard wrong, or was her sister encouraging her to go after Phil? You'd better go now before it gets dark. If you're fast enough, you'll catch George before he heads to town." Polly flung her arms around Winnie. "Thank you." Winnie's laughter followed her out of the room. Polly barely paused to change her dress. She ran out of the house, across the fields, to where the farmhands worked. Danny was packing bales of hay into the barn when she arrived looking for George. "Are you all right, Polly?" Concern laced his words. "You seem to be in a hurry to get somewhere." "I'm looking for George. I need to get to town." "You arrived just in time. He's about to leave." Relief flooded her. She quickly headed toward George. He and another farmhand were stacking the wagon full of sacks of potatoes. After she'd settled in, their journey began. The ride to town wasn't fast enough. Polly fiddled nervously with her hands, pondering what to do next. What would she say when she saw him? By the time she got to the livery, she'd calmed down somewhat. This wasn't the time to dance around the matter at hand. He had to make his intentions for her very clear, or she'd keep moping around waiting for him. Not anymore. If he had no plans to marry her, she wouldn't continue pining for him. She'd have to move on, even if it hurt. Chapter 11. "I can't believe he returned the horse after so long," Luke said, shaking his head. "He wouldn't have if the sheriff hadn't caught up with him." "I'll have to thank the sheriff again." Phil bent to examine the hooves. "Looks like nothing's amiss." "All right." Luke patted the horse's rear end. "I'll be off." Phil had just stepped out of the stall when he heard the sound of approaching footsteps. He chuckled under his breath. "Did you forget your hat again, Luke?" "Phil." Phil whirled around to face her. "Polly." His heart picked up, and he took a step closer to her. As she stood before him, he recalled their last time together. For the first time ever, he'd attended a party in town, and he'd loved it. Maybe that was because Polly was with him. Then the letter had changed everything. All his plans, his longing to build a family with her, everything had been put to a halt immediately when he'd read that letter. "You stopped visiting." Although she spoke quietly, he heard the accusation in her tone. The hurt in her eyes broke his heart. How could he explain that he'd stayed away for her own good? He'd spent the past week looking over his shoulder, dreading the moment Herman would arrive out of the blue, demanding the one thing he hadn't taken from his brother. What would Herman do if he discovered how important Polly was to him? He'd no doubt use it against him. Phil had spent that night awake, deep in thought. By dawn, he made his decision. He had to stay away from Polly, at least until he was sure of Herman's whereabouts. "I waited for you that day. I wore the yellow dress you liked, and I waited on the porch for you until the sun went down. I kept on telling myself you'd come, even when it was getting dark. But you didn't come that day or the next, or days afterward." Her lips trembled. "Why?" Phil pinched the bridge of his nose, struggling to gather his thoughts. He'd intentionally avoided telling her about the silver owl. It hadn't seemed necessary then, and now it was too late to explain. "I'm sorry, Polly." She stared at him in silence for several minutes. Taking a step back, she shook her head. "You don't want to marry me." "No, that's not. Well. This is where you've been hiding." Phil's blood ran cold. He looked past Polly to a man clad in a pinstriped suit, his hand firmly grasping a cane. Herman. Retrieving a cigar from between his lips, he shot Phil a pointed look. "You can run, but you can't hide. You hid for a year. I'll give you that. But I never rest until I take what rightfully belongs to me." Herman's lips curled in distaste. "You know, it wasn't so easy to find you. No one in town knows a Phil Carter. Then it occurred to me that you might have returned to using your father's name. Phil Kenton. The name suits you better. You could never be a Carter, no matter how refined you were." "Who's this man?" Polly asked. "What's going on?" Phil stepped forward so he was standing between Polly and Herman. Herman raised a brow, staring at Polly with renewed interest. "You got yourself a wife." He scanned the surroundings, grimacing. "And set up your own establishment with my money." Phil gritted his teeth. "It's not your." Herman waved him off. "You grabbed the portion of my wealth that you could get your hands on and fled. Everyone in New York knows what you are, an ungrateful thief." Phil's blood boiled. He curled his hands into a fist. "Don't you dare. I'm not the criminal here. You are. You killed your own brother so you could take over his property." Herman had the effrontery to appear shocked. His eyes widened slightly, and he placed a hand on his chest. That's a ridiculous allegation. William died of a weak heart. Because you robbed him of his money. Herman's eyes hardened. I didn't come all this way to argue with you. You know what I'm here for. You can have your dirty stable and whatever else you purchased with my money. But that owl, I want it back. Phil scoffed. It was never yours. His gaze dropped to Herman's hand, which had tightened on the cane. It was turning white. Herman's face darkened. Don't upset me, Kenton. Give me what I came for, and we'll forget this happened. I could report you for stealing, but I choose to take my brother's affection for you into consideration. What does he want? Polly asked. What did you take from him? Phil turned to her. I'll explain everything once this is over, I promise. When he turned to face Herman, his heart dropped to his stomach. The older man was holding up a gun. Where is it? He spoke through gritted teeth. Where is the owl? Phil angled his body so he was shielding Polly from Herman. He kept his gaze on Herman's shaking hand. Tell me where it is, or I won't hesitate to shoot. For the first time in a while, Phil felt fear. Herman had a crazed look in his eye. The desperation of a man been doing all it took to get what he wanted. Phil's mind raced. He wouldn't have taken the owl if William hadn't given it to him. A part of him had reveled in spiting Herman by denying him what he wanted so badly. Now it no longer made sense to keep holding on to it. Was it worth holding on to at the risk of losing his life and Polly's? It's not here, he said. It's not. Then where is it? Tell me. A sudden movement caught Phil's eye. Luke was creeping in behind Herman, holding a pistol. Phil quickly looked away. In one swift move, Luke struck Herman over the head with the barrel. Herman fell to the floor, dazed. Phil stared at the older man. Relief flooded him. Polly ran to his side, wrapping her arms around him. Who is he? Luke asked. He bent to retrieve the gun from Herman's grasp. Why did he want to shoot you? A criminal that managed to go unpunished, Phil said. He held Polly to him. She was shaking against him, burying her face into his chest. His pulse started slowing. It's all right. He pressed a kiss to her hair. We're safe now. Epilogue. Polly. Polly laughed as Lanny ran into her. She tousled the girl's hair. My, did you get taller? Lanny giggled. You saw me last week. She looked past Polly. She frowned slightly, cocking her head. She glanced between Polly and Phil. After a short silence, she crossed her arms and narrowed her eyes. Are you getting married? Phil wrapped an arm around Polly's waist and smiled down at her. Soon. Polly's heart fluttered. The promise in his eyes gave her hope. In the past month, they'd spent a lot of time together. Phil had become quite sociable. They attended outdoor events together, went on picnics, and he'd started teaching her how to ride. The clash with Herman had been traumatizing, but they'd pushed past it. In that moment, watching a stranger point a gun at Phil, Polly had never been so afraid. She'd been too rigid with fear to do anything but stare. Afterward, Herman was arrested, and Phil explained everything. He'd made a promise to her that she still held him to. Never keep things from her again. Phil clasped her hand. Polly knew that look in his eye. He was up to something. And whatever it was, he wouldn't tell her until he was ready. They followed Lanny into the house. Winnie was holding Keith, pacing the parlor and patting him on the back. Thank goodness you're here. I've been trying to get him to stop crying for ages. Helen needs help setting the table. She flashed a smile at Phil. Welcome, Phil. Polly's heart warmed. Phil and her sister may never be close, but it was wonderful to see them make attempts at being friendly. Keith's cry rang out. Winnie started pacing again. I hope my baby doesn't cry as much as you, Keith, she groaned. How does Helen get any sleep? I don't, Helen said from the kitchen. Footsteps thudded down the stairs. Seth and Danny entered the parlor, speaking in low tones. You made it, Seth said, extending a hand to Phil. It's great to have you here, Phil. Danny grabbed Phil's hand. There's something about the MacPherson sisters, eh? He winked. Laughter filled the room, overshadowing Keith's cries. The sound startled Keith, and he went quiet for a moment. Winnie exhaled audibly. The baby launched into another cry. Winnie handed the baby to Polly. Hush, child, Polly said softly, dancing from foot to foot. Softly, she started humming a tune. A smile curved her lips. It was the same tune Florence hummed whenever she was busy preparing a meal. As she comforted Keith, she watched the others. Phil was conversing with Danny and Seth. The men mumbled something in a low tone and laughed. "You'll startle Keith," Lanny scolded them. "Sorry, miss," Danny said with a chuckle. "We'll be as quiet as we can." Keith soon stopped crying. Everyone moved to the dinner table. The air was filled with easy conversation and soft laughter. Steaming platters of food graced the table, and Polly's stomach growled as she inhaled the mouth-watering aroma. "I can't wait to eat this," Polly said, taking a seat next to Phil. "And I can't wait to have Sunday dinner at your house eating your food," Helen said. She looked at Phil with a small smile on her face. Polly turned to Phil, but he was speaking to Seth. Helen stretched her arms out for the baby. "He'll soon be asleep. I'll hold him for a while." Polly barely heard what she said. Her heart was racing in anticipation. Another hint. She knew she'd get married to Phil. What she didn't know was when. They'd agreed to court properly for a while before getting married. "Forever is a long time. There's no need to rush," Phil had said. She'd heartily agreed. There was a lot she needed to learn before becoming a wife. Sewing, for one, and she was still working on her cooking. Her lips curved in a satisfied smile as she watched Keith sleeping peacefully in his mother's arms. Well, at least she had that part covered. Raising children wouldn't be so hard. They dug into the meal. Polly was so buried in her musing that she hardly paid attention to the food. "Polly?" She blinked the room into focus. What? Have you gotten a response from Rose?" Winnie asked. "Not yet." It was taking longer than usual for Rose to respond. It was odd. Rose's letters were always long and detailed. She described everything that happened in Deadwood, including the town gossip. Her letters were a source of amusement for Polly. "I wouldn't worry too much," Helen said. "I'm sure she'll send a missive soon." "Rose never resists the chance to write letters," Winnie added with a chuckle. "My, how I've missed her. We'll all meet again someday and have a big dinner with all our families." "We'd better get a bigger house," Seth said, and they all laughed. "We could use your hotel," Danny said. Phil cleared his throat. "I suppose this is as good a time as any." Polly raised a brow. "What?" Silence descended upon the room. Polly glanced around. Her sisters were holding hands, smiling at each other. When she turned back, Phil was on bended knee. Polly's mouth went dry. It was happening. She'd known it would, yet. She gasped, tears jumping to her eyes. "Phil, hold on till I finish before you cry, or else I'll forget my words." Polly nodded and clasped a hand over her mouth. "From the moment I saw you reaching for the bag of coffee at the storehouse, you've had me completely besotted. You are the most wonderful person I've ever met, Polly. You inspired me to open up my heart with your warmth and love." Polly blinked rapidly. Phil. Nothing else came to mind. She couldn't believe this. He was proposing to her right in front of her family. "I can't imagine anyone else I'd love to spend the rest of my life with." He flashed a smile at Winnie. "Maybe meeting Winnie prepared me for the MacPherson sister I'd spend the rest of my life with." She giggled, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "I love you, Polly." He held up a ring. "Will you marry me?" Polly's hand shook as she placed it on his. He placed the ring on her finger. Applause erupted at the table. "Another wedding!" Polly smiled into his eyes. "Why do I feel I'm the last person to know?" Phil chuckled and drew her to him. "I know how much you love your family. I figured doing this in front of them will make you happier." Polly smiled through her tears. Her heart was fuller than it had ever been. Barely 2 months ago, she'd been admiring a couple and daydreaming of her happily ever after. It had come sooner than she'd thought. "So I'm marrying the dashing gentleman on the dark horse," she grinned. He held her close to him. "And I'm marrying the woman in the yellow dress." Polly grinned. Soon she was enveloped in hugs and well wishes. She couldn't stop smiling. Finally, after the hurdles of the past, everything was falling into place. She wouldn't have to leave her sisters to travel to a new town and start over. She'd stay right here in Crescent City with the man she loved. Attending Sunday dinners and watching her nephew grow, she'd gotten all she'd hoped for and more. Love and the renewed bond of sisterhood.